Hey folks, welcome to the Write in the Head podcast with me, John Paul Sperling. I'm a writer and a life coach. This podcast is where we bring those two worlds together, talking about the mindset required to turn the passionate pursuit of writing into a thriving career. Coming up on today's episode. Allyson Barkley is the author of the fantasy series Until the Stars Are Dead, including Kirkus Star recipients In Memory of Light and A Vision in Smoke. Allyson and I talk about creating expansive story worlds, focusing on character, and dealing with procrastination. Allyson Barkley, welcome to the Write in the Head podcast. How are you today?
I am doing great. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you for making the time. I'm very excited about the conversation about staying on track, about avoiding overwhelm when it comes to big story worlds. We're going to dive into that. I want to open the conversation with a question that's fascinating to me when I ask any writers this, and especially somebody who is a novelist. That question is, Allyson, why are you a writer?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think the answer to that question has changed over time for me, which is one thing that's really lovely about writing is you can always sort of take what you want from it. I have loved writing and the creative process since I was very young, like probably since I could pick up a pen and write. And enjoyed that a lot as a kid growing up, spending time in these imaginary worlds and creating things that were interesting and exciting to me. As I got a little older and then was in college, I had taken time away from sort of the more creative side of life and came back to that when I was spending some time studying abroad in Spain and did a lot of travel. And I was working through a lot of difficult personal things, processing grief, processing the nature of changing relationships. And I was traveling alone for a couple months over that summer and really found myself sort of re-inspired to write again. And at that point, it became something that was really a way to process the world around me and to process my own feelings and experiences, sometimes very consciously and sometimes more subconsciously. It was sort of a safe space for me to go to, but also a way to think about how to answer some of these big questions I had or solve some of the problems I was facing through a fictional world, which is a really great space to be in if you're trying to understand how to react to certain things. You can, invite your characters to look at these questions and come up with a million different solutions to them. That's super, super interesting. And that was interesting to me, but I soon found that was also interesting to other people who read it and found something, useful or relatable or fun. And so I think my relationship with that has evolved over time. Sometimes it's been more just, this is a fun space to play with, and sometimes that it's something that I just really need. And I think I spend a lot of time retreating to those worlds in my head, whether that's out of that sense of need or whether it's, I'm kind of bored with whatever else is going on and I get to do something that's a little bit more fun. But I do think that's something special about creative spaces is it can be an escape from bad things, from, whatever your sort of daily life is. And it can also just be something that gives you really great energy.
Definitely, yes. Yeah, there's something so powerful about exploring your own challenges in life through narrative. It's honestly, I would say everybody to write at some point in their life. Even if it's not something they want to do professionally, start writing. Just start exploring what comes out when you put pen to paper or fingers on keys. It's so therapeutic, it can be cathartic, and very revealing, I would say. Also, some of the things that come out when I start writing, and not even a screenplay, but just brainstorming, it's quite revealing, I would say. So, where does your love of the fantasy world come from? Was there a specific thing that happened to you that made you think, yeah, this is my space? Or was that gradual over time? How did that whole thing come to play out in your life?
Yeah, well, I grew up reading a lot of fantasy and watching fantasy, Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia and all of the sort of the big classics like that, as well as maybe some less popularly known series. And so that's something I enjoyed a lot, but again, sort of lost touch with that side of myself, sort of high school, college, those years, just because I think I was really focused on schoolwork and all these other things going on. And I moved away from, the reading for fun and the writing for fun. And again, spent some time living in Spain and had all this time to, study and get to know the culture and everything and travel. But also, I was just way less busy than I had been for many, many years. And so I found that sense of creativity again. Like suddenly I had this free time on my hands and I felt like my mind was just starting to work again because I was experiencing all of these new things and meeting new people and seeing, places I had never seen before. And I spent some time hiking in Switzerland for, I think it was about 3 weeks, and I was by myself. And basically, I would just sort of wake up and decide to get on a train and go somewhere and get dropped off at a random town and just kind of start walking until I found a trail, and just like hike for the whole day. I think now if I did that kind of trip, I would plan it a lot better. But at the time, it seemed like a good idea to just aimlessly wander.
Hmm. Yeah.
And one thing that I found outside of the fact that, the landscapes there are just absolutely stunning, was that a lot of the smaller towns and the particular, mountains or rivers or caves or whatnot had some level of association with local legends. And so I was really drawn to this idea of, you find these sort of tunnels carved into a particular mountain, and the way those are explained are that, a dragon used to live here and it burrowed tunnels through the mountain, or there was a particular river with, really deep sort of caverns around it, and that's because a troll once lived there. And I kept encountering these, whether it was, in local guidebooks or signs posted or whatever. And I thought that was so cool that the land around you, it feels so sort of spiritual and so magical. And then there are actual legends assigned to that, that kind of can spark that creativity even further. And so as I traveled, I kind of pictured these things happening. And I came back from that experience and I had so many ideas in my head. I did not write a fantasy story based on those specific legends or myths, but I kind of had this sense of like the magic that was just woven into the landscape. And so I started writing a story about a young woman traveling, through these really epic landscapes and sort of the different encounters she was having and the way that the world was, the society she lived in was kind of acting upon that landscape and vice versa. And so it kind of brought me back to my love for fantasy. I had sort of forgotten about it, which seems really silly now. It feels like such an important part of me, but um, it's such an amazing way to be able to explore all those questions I was talking about earlier, whether it's your own feelings and experiences or what you're watching happening in the news or watching your family members or friends go through or whatever it is. Um, because you can totally make up the rules, and you can think about how a regular person would react to these wild scenarios, whether it's, a magic or wars or, some kind of crazy storyline that you come up with, in a completely made up universe. And so I think there's a lot of room to play with that, that you don't get if you're confining yourself to something that's, contemporary and thinking about what would happen in the world that we do exist in. So I think it's a lot of fun.
Yes, it's fantasy. You get to make up the rules.
Mhm.
And actually, I'm going to circle back to that because that's a really interesting point. Something that I've learned from my very small amount of dabbling in fantasy worlds is that the rules actually do have to exist, and you have to spend quite a lot of time thinking about those because otherwise your audience will see through it, and that it kind of breaks that suspension of disbelief. It's really interesting. Before we dive into that, there's something else here that just occurred to me because you're dealing in such big worlds And I, of course, see the board behind you here that's no doubt going to come up in conversation. Where do you start? Once you have an idea for a story, what's the first thing you do with that, knowing that this is going to be a big project with so many moving parts? What's the first thing that gets you up and running?
So when I started the particular series that I'm still in the midst of, I just started with a character. And that is generally how I've started all of my projects. This is actually the only fantasy project I've done. So I have two novels that are contemporary, that have not been published but are sort of in the works. And then I have this fantasy series, two of which are out, and the third, which is on the way. Um, but all of them, regardless of genre, I very much started with the character. I think if I were to start another fantasy project, which I plan to do at some point, I would consider the world a little bit more, but it would all, to start with, but it would always start with the character for me. I don't think that you can have a story without really solid characters, whether it's really centered around one person's story or a group of people. Um, it doesn't matter how incredible that world is. And I read a lot of fantasy series or started a lot of fantasy series where I think the idea here is so great, the world is so amazing, but the characters just don't resonate with me. And I don't care how great the plot is, how impressive the system of magic is, or whatever it is you've built. If the characters don't work, I don't care about what happens to them, you know? And so for me, it always starts with the character and thinking about what that arc looks like. So obviously want to understand where they've been and where they are now, but I really want to know where they're going. And so thinking about what that arc is going to be, what sort of challenges they're going to face and growth they're going to have to go through, in order to get to a particular endpoint is really, really important to me. And then the next step is, okay, in what world are they existing? Who else are they interacting with? Is there, a sort of political system I need to think about? Is there a magical system? If it's, again, this is all in the fantasy context, are there other types of creatures here beyond humans that we have to account for? What does the world actually look like? For me, that was really important. So one of the things on the board right there is a map that I drew by hand. I now have a map that's in the books that I got someone to design, that looks way prettier because I'm not an artist. But I use that map religiously, the hand-drawn one, because such a central part of the story for me, especially in the first like book and a half or so, is the actual journey that she takes, the physical journey that my character takes. And so much of what she's experiencing and the way that she's growing is actually by visiting these different places, and sort of uh, meeting different people, but also seeing different landscapes and different forces of nature in a way that impacts her. And so for me, where everything is located and how it fits together is super, super important. And so having that actually drawn out is really key. And I'm actually hitting a point in the third book now where I'm having to stop and draw out a map of the city they've been in because I'm starting to reference too many different neighborhoods and too many different places. And I'm like, the writing is getting away from me unless I can sketch this out better. And so I think that kind of thing is really, really important. Again, if you're writing a story set in, New York or LA or wherever, you can just look at a map on your computer and you know where everything is and you're not having to come up with that. But especially in a story that's really tied to place and it's a place that your readers aren't familiar with, I think it's so important to understand actually where everything is, and what it looks like. So
Yeah, 100%. It's so different to writing a sitcom, for example, or anything that's kind of set in today's world where most people are familiar with most of what we'd be seeing on screen. I don't have much experience with this, but I have written a superhero movie set in the future, not too far in the future, but things would definitely be different, very much leaning into the way that technology has evolved. And so there's a questionnaire that I found online to help build any particular world, and it's things like, is there still politics? What food do they eat? What is technology doing with our health? Are there still sports teams? You know, it's very, very exhausting to go through that, but it does help you to create this world. And with that, I think, comes the rules that these people would live by. It was really, really interesting to go through that. Do you have a similar thing? Do you have a set of questions, or has it kind of been different each time?
It's been a little different. Again, this series I started with book one during this very formative period of my life, and I was really just writing for me. There was no intent to share it with anyone or to publish it. And so there are a lot of things I would do differently now, and I have done differently as I've moved through the series. But because the sort of baseline was already there, it has limited the way I can build the world now, which is sort of a roundabout way to saying, no, I did not have a set of questions or anything like that. There were certain things that I thought through in a relatively intentional way, but other things that I didn't, and I now wish I had. And I've had to sort of adapt to that in various ways. Honestly, for me, something that's been really important is having, alpha readers and people that are, which I don't know if that's a thing in screenwriting, but in novels,
Let's find out. How do we
yeah.
define alpha reader?
So alpha readers are the people that sort of take the first pass at your book. So not necessarily your actual editor. It could be a group of friends, or it could be sometimes authors have critique partners, which I think is in any medium of writing. So it could be other authors like that. But basically people who are looking at like the big picture issues, like does the plot make sense? Do the character arcs work? And those people are the ones who are really good, I found, at calling out sort of the glaring world building issues, or asking those questions of like, yeah, what is their money system? Or, like, do they have sports teams? Or, like those questions that maybe you didn't think of on your first pass through. And so that's been super useful to me on all of the books in the series, having people say, I just thought of this, but like you wrote this part about X, Y, and Z, and now I'm wondering, A, B, and C. And so that's really helpful. And sometimes I think it doesn't really matter. Like it doesn't impact the story. Most readers aren't going to really care about that detail, or I just don't have the words in the pages to go and add this extra layer in. But other times it is really important or really interesting, or it would impact the story in some way if it's something that I can explain. So I do take the time to do that. But so that's really helpful for me. And I've tried to find the people sort of in my life that are really good at asking those questions and lean into them for that type of support. So
Yeah. Something you said earlier about starting with character, I made a mental note to come back to that. It's similar to my process, but maybe slightly different. And I want to unpack that because I might learn something here. What I love to do is, when I'm writing a screenplay, start with the end in mind. And that typically, for me, takes on the form of what has my protagonist learned at that point, and therefore, kind of what is the message of this movie or this TV show? Is that a similar feeling to what you were describing earlier when it comes to starting with a character arc, or are you more focused on literally just the character, that journey, rather than going kind of, because I feel like I go kind of esoteric with what's the meaning of this whole story and what can we teach people? And that's probably coming back to, spending years coaching people. But I do enjoy that feeling of, okay, I know what the finale is going to be. I know why people will talk about this when they've finished reading or watching. Now let's work backwards and get the rest of it filled out. It's similar to yours?
um, I would say it's similar, but I think I somewhere in between the two things you described. So I definitely at least for my primary protagonist and maybe one or two other characters, sort of the most important characters, they really just come to me. Like I just can't even think of a plot line or a storyline or anything unless I have that like feeling and that connection. And so in any of the projects I've had, whether they're finished projects or not, it's very much been like this is this one person that came to me, and I just saw them here in, whether again this was a contemporary real life setting or um, in this fantasy world, and I knew who they were and what they looked like and how they spoke and what they were dealing with. And then from there, I said, okay, what can I extrapolate from that to tell that story, as you said, or to share that lesson or whatever it is. And so, but I just knew who they were, and they were instantly important to me. I mean, maybe not literally in 5 seconds, but after a few minutes of thought and of thinking and maybe writing a few pages about them, I felt like they had something important going on that I needed to share. And I would say with Ari, my main character in the fantasy series, um, her sort of final arc has changed a lot for me, what I wanted that to be and what I thought it meant, but uh it's kind of always been there. What her journey, her emotional journey has always been there. The way that she got there has kind of changed over time through various iterations of the different books, but I always knew where are we starting with and what's the end goal as far as sort of the personal lessons that she's learning. But I think it's characters are such an interesting way to explore um, just like the basic sort of human conditions that we all experience. A lot of my writing has been very centered around my experiences with grief, and so and that's one example, but I think you can apply that to anything. What I love to do is take different people who have experienced a similar type of life event, if whether that's a tragedy that they're grieving or something really good. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but a life event that everyone can kind of relate to and explore how they react to that differently. And I think that's just like super, super interesting. And that's kind of what I've done with the series that I'm working on now is I have my protagonist, and she is going through her own journey, but I have these supporting characters who have experienced sort of variations on maybe what she has, and thinking about how do different people react differently? How does it shape them? And again, that's kind of telling that overarching story. What's the takeaway? What's the lesson here?
Hmm. Hmm. I have been meaning since the beginning of this call to ask you about the board behind you, and I think this is the right time to do it because what we've talked about so far, it begs the question, how do you keep track of all of this? You've got multiple characters, even if it's just protagonist and two supporting. Their arcs alone, it's a big adventure inside this big world. So talk us through how you keep on top of this big world and what are you doing with the murder board behind you?
That's the murder board. I have to explain it all the time if I'm on like a work call or something that's not writing related. So I appreciate being in a space where no one's afraid of it. So I have different up here, different characters listed out, and then the note cards below are different events that are supposed to be happening. And I kind of tried to line them up with how the timing, across. And then on this side, there's a little bit more like general plot, um, sort of overarching themes or general plot mechanics that are on a larger scale than an individual character. So it's like a major event that happens across the country, right? Or something that's not going to be specific to one character. It looks a little messy. Some of them kind of fell off, or, I haven't messed with this recently because I've been just trying to do the writing part of it. And then I'll kind of go back and I'll look at it and move things around, and then I'll do the writing, part of that, and then check and make sure everything still looks good. But yeah, I think this was really helpful for me with the first, again, like book and a half or so. It was a lot of sort of this odyssey that she was taking along with our other primary character, who joins her partway along her route. And so keeping track of two people was really not very hard. Like I wanted to know what was happening at a larger scale, but they're very focused on their own business, and I didn't have additional POVs or anything at that point. Once we hit a certain point in the second book, suddenly there are a ton more characters, and there's going to be a lot more happening. And then by the time we get into the second book, I have several more POVs as well. And so it starts to just become a lot more to juggle. And at that point, I hope at least my readers are more invested in some of these other characters too. And so at that, you really don't want to drop the ball and introduce someone who feels like they're going to be really important and then kind of forget about them. And so this is a way for me of reminding myself, like, everyone is existing throughout this process. I think it's really easy when you're writing a long form piece like this, and especially something that is in a fictional world, where it's not like, okay, what is the other character doing during this week? Well, they're probably going to work 9 to 5, Monday through Wednesday, or Monday through Friday, and then, whatever else. Like, I have to explain what do these people do with their time, right? Because they're not existing in the world that we know. So this is a way of like keeping myself accountable and making sure that there are still other things that are happening, that we have explanations if someone just kind of disappears off the page for a while. And so that's kind of what I tried to do there. And then also making sure that their timelines make sense, right? So it's very easy while some of your main characters are interacting to think of a bunch of important scenes and a bunch of important things, going on, but you don't want to have that timeline get sort of wonky. And so that's sort of what the planning is there. I know a lot of authors will use, different platforms online and things like that to plot out. I'm very like sort of tactile and visual in this way. And so for me, being able to write out the scene or write out the moment and put it up on the board was really helpful.
Mm.
But I know everyone's different.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, it
Everyone
makes
has
for
their
great
thing.
office art.
It does make for good office art. Is there an in between stage, so somewhere between the murder board and writing the actual finished product? Is there an outline? Are we outlining the whole book so we know where we're going? Or is it let's start writing and see where it goes? Because I've used both approaches to do scripts before, and I think there's pros and cons of both. Which one do you prefer?
I'm not an outline person. I think that having some sense of an outline is useful. And so I'm more of like a bullet ideas person. I need to start writing something before I can outline, before I can murder board, like any of that. I need to have written at least a couple chapters so I feel that connection to the characters and have a sense of where the story is going. I'm a very character-driven writer, as I already referenced. And so there are times where I thought the story was going somewhere entirely different. And then I started writing, and my characters told me, no, that's not what you're doing. And we went a different direction. I just don't think that you can get a feel for it until like they've showed enough of themselves to you, which I realize to people who aren't as character driven, maybe that sounds super crazy. But I really think that they like you don't know where you're going until they kind of tell you and see like I think as you mentioned earlier when you were kind of giving that guidance about how everyone should try to write something even if you're not trying to publish it or produce it or whatnot. I can think about it all day long, but until I actually start typing it, I don't know exactly how it's going to come out. And I learned so much about myself and about my characters and about that world as I'm actually writing it. Like it starts to click into place and make sense. And so I could try to outline all day long, and there's just no way that I would end up sticking to that. And so I usually write a few chapters, and then I kind of do a little bullet list or a few, quick sentences explaining at, various points throughout the story, what do I think is going to happen roughly, or what are those arcs going to look like? But it's really very cursory. It's not going to be super detailed. I definitely don't plan out by chapter. I know a lot of authors who literally will say like, okay, chapters 1 through 40, this is what's happening in each one. And it's super regulated like that. And I don't write that way. I just kind of start going. And then I think, okay, it's been about 15 pages. I should probably put a chapter break here, and then I'll go back later. And that's something my editor is great at and saying, okay, like this one is way too long, or this is actually a better place to cut it off or whatever. And, we can move that around. But to me, that's just not how my brain works. This is one big story, this whole series. And I can break it up however I want, but the story arc is so much bigger and broader than that in my head. So yeah, I'm kind of rambling, but to make a long story short, I get a sense of where the story is going. I do sort of a bullet list of major plot points and where I want it to end up. And then at some point, I start writing the whole thing, but I'm not great at going from start to finish. And so what I typically do is I just write the scenes that are kind of speaking to me. And so often I'll have written the very beginning and the very end before I do anything in the middle. Because I have such a vision for the ending and where I want all these characters to be and how I want to portray those really intense, climactic moments and all of that. And then what I do is I'm filling in random pieces, some of those, again, most exciting moments or most integral plot points. Or maybe it's just like a conversation I thought was really interesting, like I overheard someone in the hall somewhere saying something and I thought that's a really interesting comment. And then I kind of like ruminated on enough until it becomes a whole bit of dialogue that's in my book. The inspiration comes from everywhere, but I end up with basically a giant document on my computer of scenes roughly in the order I think they're going to go. And then I'll start back at the beginning and I'll just start copying and pasting them in and then filling in whatever comes in between as I go. So it's kind of a weird system, but it works for me. And this sort of goes back to your earlier points about, getting organized and keeping yourself on track. And for me, it's like, it's better to write than to not write. And so if I'm staring at, what's supposed to be chapter 10 and I have no ideas for chapter 10, like I would rather go work on chapter 37, and get something done today. Even if
Yeah.
it means a little out of order. So
Yeah, no, it's so true. What I've discovered in my process is I'm such a logical thinker, so I want to map out my exact process for creating a screenplay, and I want it to be exactly the same every time. So start with a theme, then develop a protagonist, then move to mapping out the 15 major beats, then move to an outline, then move to writing the actual pages. In reality, it's bits of those things all happening sort of at the same time. And it's that feeling of I'm going to start from the end and work backwards, and start from the beginning and work forwards. And the mission is to make them meet in the middle. So then you end up with that spine of the story from which you can start refining, revising until you get the finished product. It's messy. It feels messy right up until the moment you've finished what would be considered a first draft. Then you can look at it and think, oh, I guess it all kind of came together in the end. But there was moments where it felt absolutely chaotic. And that breaks my brain because I want everything to feel step one, step two, step three. I just don't think it's like that. Or not for me anyway. Maybe some people have got it down to that much of a refined process, but I'm not there yet. Not at all. It's chaotic.
I'm always surprised when I read it back and it actually makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, this
Same
is
here.
good.
Yeah, and you notice all the tiny cracks that you had to paper over in your thinking, whereas nobody else would ever notice those. But you see them all. Every time I read any of my scripts, like, I know the amount of effort that went into that one scene to join the two scenes either side of it up in a way that made sense.
Yeah.
It's quite amazing how that actually works. So let's talk about some of the mindset of a novelist versus screenwriter. I'm fairly sure there's a significant amount of overlap here, but I am curious because we do slightly different things. So, when it comes to procrastination, it's a part of every creator's journey. I should imagine that when you're dealing with these big story worlds, there's probably potential to become more susceptible to procrastination because whenever you want to sit down and write, you have to do it in such a big world that you've created. So, in terms of tools and techniques that you've picked up on that have helped you with procrastination, anything you could share there?
Yeah, I think for me, well, first I want to acknowledge that everyone who's writing has completely different responsibilities and life constraints. And so whether you're a full-time writer or a part-time writer or what have you, I think it can look really different. I am part-time because I have another career and plenty of other things going on in my life. So it definitely comes in waves when I'm able to create more time for my writing work. But generally speaking, I like to make sure that I at least have a couple days a week that I've done something. In my kind of more free eras, I'm able to work every single day on it, but it really varies. And so if I have a day that I said, today it's really important to me that I get to this, I try to be really gracious with myself, and understand that spending time on my writing does not mean that I wrote an entire chapter or a certain amount of words. I don't know if screenwriters are like this, but I know novelists are like this. People love to talk about their word count. They love to use these different trackers and, post online or share with critique
Mm-hmm.
partners or whatever it is and say
Yeah.
how many words they did that day or that week or that month. They
I
have
think I
word
think with
count
screenwriters it's
goals.
more about pages. I think that's
Yeah,
what we say I
yeah.
did 5 pages today.
Right. I tend to think in pages, but most people in this space tend to think in words. And for
Mm.
me, that's just not productive. And it's also not that meaningful. You could write 5 words that are like really good, or you could write 500 words that are really bad, and so I think the general idea is good though, that you did something and that's what matters, and you can always go back and scrap it, or you can, workshop it. But for me, it's really, I'm not going to stick with a certain number of words I want to hit or even pages I want to hit. I'm not even going to have to write it all. If I'm just staring at this blank page and I'm so stuck, like I'm going to go pick a section that I know needs some work and I'm just going to edit it for an hour. And just doing something to make progress on the manuscript is so, so helpful. And doing something like this, like doing the whole murder board thing, if I feel like, hey, I haven't looked at this in a while, I'm feeling kind of stuck with the writing, I want to go look at these scenes that I do have sketched out, compare them with what's on the board. Do I like the way that it's turned out? Do I want to shift some things around? Did I forget about, a key section that I put up on the board that I still think is actually going to be useful? Let me think about where that fits in. Or maybe I skipped a key section and now I'm realizing it's not so key after all, and I'm going to take it off. So spending some time with that world, I think, can be just as useful as spending time actually writing it. Um, that said, I don't want to spend weeks and weeks just working on the world building stuff or just editing and not writing anything, because then you really start to lose momentum. And it's super easy, as you said, in a project with such a large scope, to spend too much time planning and
Yeah.
not enough
Yeah.
time actually jumping into the writing.
Yeah.
That's not
Planning the thing is not the same as doing the thing.
exactly. And I think the planning is important. Like you wanna make sure you're checking all the boxes and you're filling in those holes and that you understand the world and the characters and all of that. But I think it's better to use that as an addition to or an alternative to your writing on some days, but not make that, the main focus. After a certain point. And so I think really, to answer your question, it's to give myself grace and say, I'm going to do something today, but it does not have to, hit a certain metric that I've decided on. It doesn't even have to be putting actual words out there. It can be cleaning up something else that I've already done. But all within. So making sure that I don't fall into that trap of just doing that for weeks on end. And I'd also say it's really important to recognize when you do need a break. You cannot be creative every single day. That's not, at least for the average person, as someone like me, that's not a sustainable practice. And telling yourself, I have to work on this and I have to make progress every single day is just like not the healthiest way to go about it. At some point, you're going to feel burnout. And so whether that means you go and look at another project, or it just means you take a couple weeks and you don't work on your writing, like that is okay. That's also part of the process. I know with this project, after the second book came out, I felt so exhausted. I hated it. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I mean, I was a very love-hate. I loved it. I was proud of it, but I had looked at this manuscript for years on end. I had done a million rounds of edits. I had so many different people read it and give me feedback, and I was just so tired of it. And I just did not want to think about it anymore. And I couldn't, and I took some time. And probably a couple months later was when I actually was able to write again. And when I came back to the draft for book three, all of a sudden I had so much energy and so many ideas, and I was so excited in a way that I really hadn't been in probably a year or two, because I had just been working and working and working. And so I just think that time is really valuable. Again, don't let it drag on for years, but it's okay to give yourself some time off, and recognize that that's part of the process too. Like, you need time for your brain to generate new ideas,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
and to have those experiences that are going to give you that spark again.
Yeah, and I think so. The way I frame it is what's going on in your brain and how can you optimize that. So when it comes to procrastination, procrastination is really two things. It's fear of the unknown because you're about to sit down and do something you haven't done before. And it's your natural urge to conserve energy. I don't want to sit down and do hard work because we are just by design lazy. We want to conserve as many calories as we can. It kind of sounds like a strange way of framing procrastination, but what that does for me is it enables me to think, I'm supposed to feel this resistance.
Hmm.
This is being human. It's natural to not want to do this. And because you're now taking away the power of it, it actually helps you to deal with it. So, coming back to what you said about, I'm just going to sit and maybe do a few minutes today. It doesn't have to be anything big. What you're really cleverly doing there is taking away that I don't want to do hard work. You're kind of telling yourself it's not going to be that hard. And in terms of not wanting to go into the unknown, well, maybe I'll just sit and revise something that I've already done because that feels familiar. And so you're kind of hacking your brain there. Maybe you haven't thought about it in that perspective before, but it's a really clever way of overcoming procrastination. And you'll probably find, like I do, if you can get yourself to sit down and say, I'm just going to do 5 minutes, sometimes that turns into an hour because you overcome that initial resistance to doing the work.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to tell everyone now that my way of working is really clever. I haven't heard it described that way. And the other thing I would say too that gives me motivation is, I think all writers, we wouldn't be writers otherwise, know what it feels like to have that incredible spark of inspiration and to sit down and, like, the words are just pouring out of you, and it's so satisfying and so energizing, and you could just go for days and days and days because this idea is just there and you have to put it on the page. And so even when I'm in a lull in the manuscript, because I've poured out all of the really exciting ideas, and now I'm like, oh, this in between scene, another one of these, um, I'm able to keep going because I know I'm going to get to the really exciting stuff again, and that I kind of have to do the in between stuff to get back to the things that just make me feel this absolute desperation to write, which is just the best feeling in the world. And so I think it's easier to say, yeah, it's going to be a little tough, or I'm going to struggle through it for a little bit, but I know that feeling is going to come back. It's easier to kind of make yourself push through it when you have that confidence that it's going to be there, waiting for you on the other side, that sense of satisfaction.
And I think what you're saying there is there's this push and pull between can I force my creativity or do I wait for it to happen? And I don't think either one of them is exclusively true. I think that you can force yourself to stick to a routine and try to write for, let's say, 1 hour per day, because even if what you write that day is terrible, you build the routine, and that's a healthy routine. Can you force your best ideas to come to you? That's a different question. And I want to say the answer is yes, but just in my actual experience, my best ideas don't typically come when I'm sitting down at my laptop trying to write. The best ideas I've had are when I'm doing the dishes, or when I'm showering, or when I'm at the gym and I have to pause my workout and write them down because I'm so excited about them. And then I get upset because I've just interrupted my own workout. But you know what? That's a whole other conversation that we can have. So I think it's both. I think there's ways that you can force yourself to do the work. And then there's other times where, like I said, it's a push and pull, and you just have to relax and know that it will come back to you.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And having a notebook on hand is useful
Yes.
because you never know.
Yes.
I'll try to write on my phone, my notes app in my phone or
Mm-hmm.
something, and it's never the same. So I have
Mm.
some notes there. I have while I'm driving, I use the voice memo app. And so I have all these really uncomfortable long voice memos to myself of me explaining my ideas, and they're really cringy to listen back to, but then I have to go transcribe them later. And the
I
worst,
do this all the time.
yeah.
Anyone that's listened to me talking about writing before has heard me say there's a thing I call the walk and talk, where I go for
Uh-huh.
a nice long walk, I have my headphones in, I'm recording my voice onto my phone. It looks like I'm just having a conversation with somebody, so hopefully nobody thinks I'm crazy. But what I'm really doing is just going through ideas as I'm walking, and then I get home and I listen to it and I just jot down anything that's good and just filter out all the nonsense. I do that at least once a day. It's been so productive for me.
Yeah, I should do that more often. I should get over my fear of people hearing me say my ideas out loud.
It is
Uh,
quite funny sometimes because I'm talking about some very strange storyline that
mhm.
I'm working on, and I'm thinking there's people out there walking their dogs, and if they hear the part of the chat that's talking about what the protagonist is about to do, they will probably assume I'm talking about me or somebody that I know, because that's what people on phone calls are often doing. So there is moments where you think, I wonder how that came across.
Yep.
But I live in LA and everything out here is crazy. So I think I'm probably just blending in, if anything.
Yeah, I'm not in quite the same size large city as you, so I think my neighbors would remember if I was
That's
walking
true.
about
Yeah. Yeah. And you
my
might see them again in the store or something,
yeah.
whereas LA, that's probably not going to happen.
Mhm.
I want to start bringing this one home. So, one of the questions I love to ask any writer is, if somebody's listening to this and they want to walk the same or similar kind of path. So let's just say they've got a big idea for a story world. It's fantasy. It could be a screenplay or a novel, and they're just struggling to kind of get going, right? What would be the number one piece of advice you think you could give to that person?
I think just start writing. I mean, that sounds super simple and sort of silly, but I think you can always make your writing better. I really think that anyone can be a writer. It is a skill, a muscle that you can build and strengthen just like anything else. And yeah, just if you have an idea that you think isn't out there, I think the sort of cliche is, write the stories that like you wish you could read or watch in the case of screenwriting. And I think that just very much holds true. Like if it speaks to you, it's going to speak to someone else. And so just start and put some ideas out on the page. You can always completely change them around. But I do think that the further you get, the more the story will make sense to you. And so just started knocking out a couple chapters or a couple scenes, again, whatever the medium is, um, it'll start to click. And you'll be able to look back and say, oh, hey, I'm doing a lot better at this than I thought I was, in most cases. And that can kind of lend additional inspiration as you read back previous scenes you've written and think, oh, I did mention this thing. Like, let me find a way to tie this back in. Or I didn't really notice I was doing this, but I gave a particular quality to this character, and that's actually kind of cool. Let me play with that more. That happens to me a lot, actually. I look back at old stuff and I'm like, oh, that was really interesting what I did. And, I'm able to start to more consciously make use of something that I sort of subconsciously added in previous parts of the book. So I think just start going and don't worry so much about the planning. Don't worry so much about how it's all going to fit together. You can make it fit together. You can make it all orderly, but you have to have something to work with. And so as important as it is to think about where the plot's going and where the character arcs are going and what the world building looks like, if it's fantasy or any other genre, it's better to just start putting the words on the page than it is to sort of waste away worrying about all those little details. So
Yeah,
that's what I would say.
I couldn't agree more. There's a very popular expression. I might not get this 100%, but it's something like, don't wait for conditions to be perfect before starting. Starting is what makes conditions perfect. And that has always stuck with me because when you take action, you get feedback that tells you what you need to do differently. But up until that point, you're just guessing. Like you said earlier, until you start writing it, you don't know. So you can have an idea in your head and it might be great, but when you start to write it, you will learn so much more about that idea, about what needs to happen in order to fully flesh it out, turn it into a finished screenplay or book. It's painful, but it really is. It's the best advice and it's the least exciting advice. It's just get started.
If you want a more tangible thing, I think having someone to keep you accountable is super helpful as well. So if you are someone who has friends or professional connections or whatever it is in that same space, finding someone else who's also working on a manuscript is a really good way to kind of keep the energy going. So if it's your first time writing a novel or screenplay or book of poems or whatever it is, find a friend who's maybe in that position, even if they're writing in a different medium. Or like go on the internet. Honestly, social media is a robust space for authors and creators. I've made really, really good author friends through that space, and been able to share work with people and learn about how other people write, which is really, really useful. So if it is your first book, that's another place to go if you don't have friends who happen to be authors too. But I cannot recommend enough having people that are following that path, sort of at a similar rate as you to be able to say, like, we're both trying to get through however many pages this week, or we both want to work on, character building this week or something, to keep that sort of energy and enthusiasm there, but also some sense of accountability that you're kind of updating each other or you're reading each other's work, which is really useful to get early feedback
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
well.
I love that. Yeah. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go as a team. That's another expression, I guess. Truism. I don't know what it's called, but I agree with everything you're saying. Yeah, working with a partner, accountability partner, or a writing partner, if you want to go all in, it's been so transformative. And not just in writing. I think that's just good advice for any goal that you're trying to reach, is to have that somebody in your corner. Allyson, this has been fantastic. I've learned a lot today. Thank you very much for your wisdom and knowledge shared here. Where can people go if they want to know more about you, follow up with what you're working on, maybe buy some books from you? Where are the best places to send people?
Yeah, so my website, asbarkleybooks.com, pretty easy. That has links to all my social media and to purchase the books and all that good stuff. I'm primarily on Instagram. I do have a Facebook that I don't use a lot. But yeah, the website can direct you everywhere. And the books are available on all the major online booksellers. I don't think any shops in LA carry it in person. If you're on the East Coast and you're especially in North Carolina and Virginia, there's a better chance that your local bookstore might have it. But yeah, Google Books, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, IndieBound, any of the major online platforms will sell it.
We will include all the information in the description. And the final thing that I will say, which I almost forgot, let's give a shout out to Devon Founds and Slutty Chicken for sponsoring your outfit today.
Yes, I have my unreliable narrator shirt. It's my favorite piece of clothing that I own. And it's especially good humor if you're an author. The people that see me wearing it who don't know much about, literature or writing sometimes are a little concerned, but everyone else appreciates it. So
I feel like Devon would hear that and say, mission accomplished. That's what we
yeah,
wanted. We wanted to
yeah.
confuse people with this clothing. So shout
You
out to
want to draw
Devon.
attention, good attention, bad attention, it doesn't matter, but we
Exactly. exactly that. So I'll probably drop another link to Slutty Chicken in the description. Also, if you're listening to this and you want to know more about that, go back and check out the episode I did with Devon Founds. It was a fantastic episode about being more audacious as a writer. Allyson, thank you again for your time today, and let's keep in touch. This has been thoroughly enjoyable.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
All right, take care.